Okay, well, good evening, everybody. My name is Jessica Laganowski, and I am the Public Services Librarian with the Adams County Library System and the chair of the Adams County Reads One Book Committee. Thank you so much for attending this evening's program. So before I get to introduce Jason, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone enter tonight's program on mute. So you'll notice that neither your microphone nor your camera, if you have one, is turned on. However, we would love to hear from you during the presentation. Most of you will find the chat option at the bottom of your screen. A few of you will find it at the top of the screen. Press on chat and that opens up the chat box where you can type in your comments and or questions. The chat box is defaulted to share your comments and your questions with the panelists, which includes myself, Jason, and Steve Labar, a member of the Public Services team and the staff member you will most likely see leading the adult programs at the Gettysburg Library. Steve will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program and will let Jason know the comments and or questions that have been placed into the chat box during the presentation. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and can be viewed later through the Adams County Library System's YouTube channel. You can find the link to the library's YouTube channel by visiting the Adams County Library System website, www.adamslibrary.org, and clicking on the YouTube channel link about halfway down the page. You will also find other one-book programs and a variety of content for all ages. More content is added on a regular basis, so be sure to subscribe to our channel. This program tonight would not be possible without our terrific sponsors, Jim and Kathy Gardner and WellSpan Health. Thank you so much to our sponsors. And personally, I'd like to give a big thank you to the Adams County Reads One Book Committee. Putting together a one book is a 2-year process, so this has been a 2-year journey for us. And just a big thank you to Carol, Elizabeth, Emily, Janine, Michelle, Sarah, and Steve for all of your hard work. Every October, the Adams County Reads One Book program connects the Adams County community through lively discussions and programs in conjunction with one book title. The Adams County Reads One Book Committee, made up of library staff, volunteers, and Adams County community members, selects one title from a list of up to 40 title suggestions. The committee's final selection is based on the readability of the title, whether or not the committee feels the book will resonate with Adams County community members and offer great discussable opportunities, as well as the title's ability to create a variety of lifelong learning opportunities through programs and events. The Woman Who Smashed Codes was one of 5 finalist titles considered for the 2021 book program. This title was voted by the committee due to the reasons above, but also because of Jason's ability to bring Elizabeth Friedman to life. Simply, Elizabeth is inspiring and uplifting and truly mesmerizing. Jason brings to life a woman who, in the words of a presenter in a prior program this month, broke the glass ceiling before such a term existed. So now it is my pleasure to introduce the author of this amazing book, Jason Fagone. Jason is a narrative writer and investigative reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. His articles on technology, sports, and culture have appeared in The Atlantic, Mother Jones, the New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, Esquire, and Huffington Post Highline. Fagone is the author of 3 books. The most recent is The Woman Who Smashed Codes, published by Day Street Books in 2017, and named one of NPR's best books in 2017, and a 2018 notable book of the American Library Association. In 2014 and 15, he was the Knight Wallace Fellow in Journalism at the University of Michigan. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife and daughter. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Jason.
Thank you, Jessica, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I've really been looking forward to this. I am from Pennsylvania originally. I grew up in Chester County, and I love reading to library crowds. I've been told that some of you have read the book, or a lot of you have read the book. That's great. That makes me feel great. you tend to ask good questions, library folks, and we'll have a Q&A after I finish talking, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the questions that you have, seeing what you came up with. So I'm going to share my screen, and Jessica, you'll tell me if anything is sort of going askew here. All right.
Sure.
Okay, hold on. Okay, should be sharing now.
It looks good.
Looks good?
Yep.
All right. You're seeing a picture of Elizabeth Friedman here?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Before I go on, I want to thank the Adams County Library System and the Adams County Reads One Book Committee. I know that this is a long journey to put together a one book program, and thank you so much for all of your hard work. I'm really honored that you chose The Woman Who Smashed Codes. For an author, it's a very cool thing because when you're working on a book, you're essentially working on it alone, and then there's this moment when the book is published and released, and other people are reading it and responding to it, and finally, you're not alone anymore. You have community, and so you've done that for me, and I really am grateful. So I thought I would start the talk by telling you how I got started in this journey of becoming obsessed with Elizabeth Smith Friedman. And I'll tell you straight up that I'm not a mathematician. This picture is not a depiction of what my college experience was like, right? I'm not a scientist. I'm not a code breaker. I'm not an expert in codes and ciphers. And I think there may be somebody here who is. I don't know if Darren Glass is here from Gettysburg College. There's a professor, Darren teaches cryptology. And Darren is, somebody like Darren is a real expert, right? I'm a layperson, but I did know something about codes and ciphers and code breakers before I started this journey of researching the book and learning about Elizabeth, because we all know something about codes and ciphers and code breakers. I think that these are fundamentally familiar and everyday things even. So, a code is just one thing that stands for another thing. Your kid's report card is a code. A stands for good, F stands for bad. A cipher is just one thing that replaces another in a kind of rigid pattern in a message. So if we've, in elementary school, you've probably passed a secret note to your crush. You set A equal to B and B equal to C, and you write out in the cipher, do you like me, yes or no? And then, if the teacher intercepts the message, then the teacher has to become the code breaker to solve it, because the code breaker is someone who solves a secret message without knowing the key. And so I think we've all been code breakers before. So we're starting from some kind of common ground here when we're talking about it. But I didn't get into this story through math or codes or anything like that. I got into it because I was curious about a global news event that happened in 2013. So that year, Edward Snowden, who was a contractor for a government agency called the National Security Agency, disclosed that there was this big program that the agency had rolled out that was very surprising for a lot of people. So the National Security Agency is the part of the government that tries to intercept foreign communications and essentially break them if they're encrypted, solve them, figure out what terrorists are doing. In other countries, they're not supposed to be gathering up American communications, but Snowden disclosed that the NSA did have a program that was gathering up a lot of sort of our personal communications records, and people were very surprised about this. The main impact that these stories had on me was that I got really curious about the National Security Agency. I started reading about it, and when you read about the NSA, all roads lead to this guy on the screen. This is William Friedman. He is said to be the greatest code breaker who ever lived. And he is said to be the founder of the National Security Agency. He's kind of like the man. If you go to NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, then there's a bronze bust of his head in front of the auditorium. So I was reading about William Friedman, and I read there was this mention that he had a wife who was also a code breaker, someone who solved secret messages without knowing the key. I thought, well, that's interesting. How many husband and wife code breaking teams can there be? And I was really interested to learn more about his wife, whose name I read was Elizabeth. And there wasn't a lot out there, but it seemed like what was out there about Elizabeth was at this place called the Marshall Library in Virginia. So she had left her archive there, her papers. So one day I went to the Marshall Library. I think I lied to my boss. I said that I was sick. And I went to the Marshall and I asked the archivist if I could see some of Elizabeth's papers. And I'll never forget it. You know, they took me behind this vault, this metal door, and they showed me these shelves that had 22 boxes of Elizabeth Friedman's papers. And I asked for box one, and I started looking through box one. And it's a wonderful collection of letters and documents and other things. And looking through these papers, I very quickly realized that I had stumbled into what every journalist or writer kind of dreams of finding, which is an incredible untold story that really seems to matter. So I was finding in these archives the story of a code-breaking Quaker poet, a young woman who started from nothing and ended up changing the 20th century. She was a hidden woman behind the development of intelligence in America in the 20th century. She was a genius. She was someone who solved all kinds of problems and fixed all kinds of messes, often for men, but she never got credit for it. And she wasn't just the best woman code breaker of her era. She was one of the greatest code breakers of all time, period. And yet she didn't start out to be a code breaker. This was the thing that I think made me able to connect to Elizabeth in the start, because like me, she was not a mathematician or a scientist. She started out as a poet. So this is a picture of Elizabeth from her college yearbook. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Elizabeth and her early life. I think it's enough for you to know that she was born in 1892 in a small Indiana town. She was the ninth of 9 children. And the most important thing for you to know is that she did not really like her family. And she didn't like her town. And from a very young age, she was seized with this compulsion, essentially, to get out, to try to find something that was less ordinary. She felt like she was living a life that was boring and falling short of her desire for something a little more exciting. After she graduated college, she had found a job as a school teacher. And for a professional woman of her day, that was kind of the end of the line. She up and quit her job one day in 1916, and she ended up moving to Chicago to try to find a job. And she's going around Chicago, she's asking for work. She doesn't really know what she wants or what she's looking for, just something that's less ordinary. And it's not going well, and she's about to give up. But she decides that before she goes home, in failure, she wants to see something in Chicago that she's always wanted to see. She wants to see a copy of a rare volume of Shakespeare's plays from the 17th century that she had read about in college when she studied Shakespeare, but she had never actually seen in person. And so she goes to this library that she knows has a copy of the Shakespeare volume in Chicago. And at the library, this is a whole longer story that I don't think we have time to get into, but at the library, she happens to have this kind of serendipitous chance meeting with one of the wealthiest men in Chicago at the time, who was kind of like a robber baron, or I guess you'd say like a Trump, or like an Andrew Carnegie or William Randolph Hearst of Chicago, a guy named George Fabian. That's him on the right. That's Elizabeth on the left. The contrast has always struck me as pretty funny. Fabian was very much like other kind of robber barons of his era, in that he had made millions of dollars in industry and that he spent his money in lavish ways. But what distinguished George Fabian was that he, unlike people like Hearst or Carnegie, who spent a lot of their money on artwork, Fabian wanted to spend his money on science. He believed that he could be a patron for some of the best scientists in the country. He believed that he could sponsor research that would ultimately discover the secrets of nature and even unlock the mystery of eternal life. He really believed that humans could live forever if we just poured enough money into science. And so he turned his private estate outside of Chicago, a 300-acre kind of palace and grounds, opulent grounds that he called Riverbank. Over a period of years, he turned this into a legitimately cutting-edge scientific laboratory. He hired some of the best scientists in the country to work on various projects. One of the projects that was being pursued at Riverbank was a project related to Shakespeare. Fabian was kind of obsessed with secret messages. He was obsessed with Shakespeare, and he believed that there were secret messages embedded in Shakespeare's plays, the original printings, that would, if these messages were discovered and revealed, would prove that William Shakespeare wasn't actually William Shakespeare. Fabian believed that all of Shakespeare's plays had been written by a nobleman named Francis Bacon. And moreover, he believed that he could prove it. And so some of the scientists, some of the people that he hired to come out to Riverbank were people who were experts in secret messages. And when he ran into Elizabeth at the library, this is the job that he offered. He offered her a job as a researcher on this Shakespeare project. And she was dropped into this group of researchers who were trying to find the secret messages inside Shakespeare. Now, you'll notice that a number of them are women, and this is because code breaking at the time was not a sexist pursuit. But the only reason that it wasn't a sexist pursuit is because code breaking in America at this time wasn't really a pursuit at all. It wasn't a thing. It was new. And so women were not excluded from it. And Fabian even felt that women were better at this task than men because they were more patient, and code breaking required a lot of patience. So anyway, Elizabeth is brought into this group. She is told to look in these old Shakespeare enlargements from the original Shakespeare volume and try to find the secret messages. Long story short, she fails to do this. And she doesn't fail because she's bad at it. She fails because the messages aren't really there. It turns out that it's all kind of a delusion. It's a wild goose chase. They've tricked themselves into seeing something that isn't actually there. But as Elizabeth is struggling with this and failing, something important happens, which is that she happens to meet another young scientist who has been hired by George Fabian, by this rich guy, to come out to Riverbank and work on a scientific project. And this turns out to be her future husband, future founder of the National Security Agency, William Friedman. This is one of my favorite pictures of them. They were young, by the way. I love this picture. I think it says so much. William was very much the opposite of George Fabian. He was shy, kind of a nerd. He dressed in a very dapper way. He wore these polished white buck shoes. And he and Elizabeth started hanging out. They were 23, 24 years old. They were very, very young. And pretty soon they were writing love letters to each other. Not just love letters, but they're writing letters to each other in code. And this was one of the first things that I saw at the Marshall Library when I was looking at Elizabeth's papers that made me feel like, yes, I need to stop everything else that I'm doing in my life. I need to put everything else on hold. I need to invest in this and do whatever it takes to tell the story, because this is just wonderful. When you are reading 100-year-old love letters, there's just something about them, the texture of them. I would be in the library, working all day, and then at the end of the day, I would text my wife, I love you, heart emoji or something. There's just something so lame about it because I had been in the library all day reading 20-page love letters that were written, in 1917. Anyway, so something happens anyway. So at Riverbank, these two young people meet. They start to fall in love, Elizabeth and William. And they're working on the Shakespeare project that turns out to be a wild goose chase. But then in 1917, something happens. America enters World War II. World War I. And this is a war where code breakers are going to be very, very important, because this is the first war where radio is commonly used to transmit military messages. All of a sudden, with the advent of radio, there are all these secrets that are flying through the air. They can be intercepted, the dots and dashes of Morse code in which these messages were sent through radio. And if the dots and dashes of Morse code are not encrypted, if they're not protected with a code or a cipher, then anybody can intercept these messages and read what they say. And militaries can't have this, because then their plans would be leaked to the enemy, right? So all of a sudden, there's a huge premium on making codes that protect messages, and there's also a huge premium on code breaking, solving the messages. The problem for America in 1917 is that there are almost no code breakers in the entire country. This is before the NSA existed. This is before the CIA existed. The FBI at this point was very young, didn't have this capability. In fact, some of the only code breakers in the country were these kind of crazy Shakespeare people out on the Illinois prairie trying to find secret messages in these old books. And so with the start of World War I, or America's entry into World War I, George Fabian suddenly lent his Shakespeare experts to the US military. And I'm going back to this picture. What we're really looking at here is the original National Security Agency. This is the first proto-NSA, and it's almost all women. So they start working on military code breaking, and right off the bat, Elizabeth and William are amazing at this. There's just something about them together that is exponentially better than them apart. And they very quickly start to invent new scientific methods for breaking codes that turn out to be hugely important. They take this world of delusion at Riverbank, and they figure out how to turn it into a rigorous science. And they create these pamphlets that are major breakthroughs and that have historically been credited to William alone. But I found evidence in two libraries that Elizabeth was a full partner and co-author in a lot of these papers. And this is William showing you, this is from the Williams papers in the Marshall Library. He writes in her name, even though she wasn't officially credited in the printed versions. Okay, so long story short, because we don't have more time to talk about Riverbank. After World War I, the Friedmans have to escape that place. They have to kind of in the dead of night get out from the grip of George Fabian, because like many robber barons, like many extremely wealthy men, he turns out to be very domineering, very kind of paranoid, and he's trying to control their lives. And they end up leaving in the middle of the night, and they leave for Washington, D.C. They arrive there at the start of 1921 to make a new life together, and they set out to try to work for the government to apply their skills in code breaking that they've learned during the war. William goes to work for the Army, and Elizabeth goes to work with him for a very brief time, but soon she has to quit and stay home because their first child is born, a girl named Barbara. And at that point, Elizabeth kind of thought that she was done with code breaking. She wasn't particularly interested in working for the U.S. government. She kind of wanted to do her own thing. Her ambition in life at that point was to write children's books, and maybe research archaeology projects in her spare time. But the problem was, and this was a problem for Elizabeth her entire life, she was just too good at code breaking. She could not be left alone by the US government. They needed her too badly. And so this dynamic started to happen that she complained about years later. The way she put it was, men from the government keep showing up on my doorstep asking me to solve puzzles for America. And the only way I can make them go away is if I give them the answers, if I solve the puzzles. But they always come back with more puzzles. This was kind of Elizabeth's life. She was just too good. She was an essential kind of secret weapon for a lot of different parts of America throughout her career. So the first time this happened was in 1925. The first guy who showed up on her doorstep was from the US Coast Guard. And the US Coast Guard in 1925 had a problem, which you can probably guess, which is they were tasked with trying to chase down rum running boats that were running, wild during Prohibition, and they were not able to do that. One reason is just the ocean is very big, but another reason is that the rum runners had very quickly learned how to use very strong codes to protect their secret communications and protect their rum shipments on the water. So the US Coast Guard was completely clueless, and they needed a code breaker. They needed somebody who could come in and solve these intercepted radio messages from rum boats to shore so that the US Coast Guard could go after the boats and try to arrest guys and stop them. So they went to Mrs. Friedman. They showed up on her door. This is one of my favorite notes in the Marshall Archive because it's just so direct. Office of the Chief Prohibition Investigator, Mrs. Friedman, please see what you can do with this and return it to us. I mean, this was her life for years during Prohibition. Enter Elizabeth, and she starts to solve these messages, and all of a sudden the Coast Guard can see what's happening on the water. She starts to map the boats. And for the first time, the Coast Guard was able to pinpoint the exact locations of ships and start to arrest people. And a lot of the time, the guys in the ships were very confused about being arrested, and they assumed that they had been dimed out by their buddies, that there was a rat on board. They didn't understand that there was a woman in Washington who was reading every dot of what they were saying and solving their secret messages. And by looking at these messages, she learned a couple of things. One is that the rum runners were not these kind of, we have this image of rum runners as sort of gentlemen who just happened to own boats and they were in it for the love of the game and the feel of the wind on their face. That might have been true up until 1924, but after that, all of those gentlemen rum runners were run out of the business by criminal mafias that carried machine guns and were very dangerous guys. This is one of the dangerous guys that Elizabeth was intercepting messages from, and his crew. It's a guy named Kid Can. He was like the Al Capone of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Some very dangerous characters, and she got to know these guys and all of the people on their boats, the names of their boats. She understood where they were on the water, the names of the captains, and she started to map these hidden Prohibition era rum running networks. This is a map that she drew of a global mafia called the Consolidated Exporters Corporation. They had 60 to 70 boats of various sizes. Some of them were the size of baseball fields, giant floating warehouses. And they used many different systems of codes and ciphers that were very tough to crack, but she did it essentially alone for 6 or 7 years. Elizabeth solved 2,000 rum running messages per month and 25,000 per year. And it was really only her and a single clerk typist at the Coast Guard who was doing this. I really want to stress that Elizabeth was not just an amazing code breaker. She wasn't just inventing this new way to gather and analyze intelligence. She was building institutions. She was a boss, which was incredible for the time, right? She was a woman boss in a technical field in an era when that was kind of unthinkable. So after doing this alone for about 6 or 7 years, she created a code-breaking team within the US Coast Guard called Unit 387. And it was the first time that a woman had ever been in charge of a code-breaking team in the US government. And she gave herself a cool title even, a cryptanalyst in charge. And she was the boss at this point. So she was breaking thousands of messages a month. She was an amazing code breaker. She was a boss. But she was also figuring out this kind of new method of gathering intelligence and using these intercepted radio messages and solving the puzzles to kind of light up entire hidden underworld networks. She was able to, through her skills, and by communicating with all kinds of government agencies that were intercepting the messages and giving them to her, she was kind of able to flick the light switch on these criminal networks. And this would become really important a bit later in her career during World War II, when she did a very similar thing to go after the Nazis. Okay, a couple of quick things. So Prohibition ended, Elizabeth adapted. She turned her skills to going after heroin, opium, drugs, guns. She became briefly famous. This is from a true story in a magazine called True Detective Fiction Weekly. They called her a small, slender American woman who stepped in and smashed crime where men had failed. She was on the front pages of newspapers, and she was kind of alternately praised and condescended to in a lot of the coverage. This is a clip from a newspaper story that's kind of typical. Solved by women, you know. Did you know that women have brains too? That was kind of the tone of it. So this takes us to the end of the 1930s, and this is, in terms of the materials that were in the Marshall Foundation that I was able to look at in those 22 boxes that I showed you earlier. This is kind of where the trail ended, where my detective journey sort of dropped off the cliff. Because after 1938, there's almost no materials talking about Elizabeth's work in the Marshall Foundation library at all. There are materials starting in about 1946 and after that, but between 1938 and 1946, there's just this gap, and it's where World War II should be. And after I sort of processed the 22 boxes, I was really worried about this, because it didn't seem plausible to me that the US military would let one of their best code breakers just sit out World War II. So I started to look around for Elizabeth's World War II files or anything that showed that what she did during World War II. And I wasn't sure I would be able to find anything, because I was worried that the National Security Agency would still have that under lock and key, that maybe they were in a safe somewhere, or they were classified and there was no way to ever get them. Or alternately, maybe they had already been declassified, but they were in the National Archives system, which I don't know if any of you have done research in the National Archives system, but it is vast and it is not digitized. It's essentially like this. If you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, the last scene of the movie when they wheel the Ark into this government warehouse, this warehouse is essentially the National Archives. So I had no idea whether I would be able to find what Elizabeth did in World War II. And ultimately, after a year of searching the National Archives and going back again and again, I found it. It's a 329-page technical manual of everything Elizabeth and her Coast Guard unit did in World War II. And every page of it is stamped top secret, secret ultra. So I'm already kind of like over the time that I wanted to talk, because I wanted to preserve, you know, a good chunk of time, half an hour for a Q&A. So I'm going to try to do the rest of this very quickly. So I apologize for speeding through this. I just want to give you some sense of the flavor of what Elizabeth did during World War II. Essentially, she went after Nazi spies who were operating in South America. At the start of World War II, 1939, Hitler invades Poland and Nazi spies begin spreading into the Western Hemisphere. They set up shop in particular in South America, in countries where there are a lot of German nationals there. And they bring the spies, when they go to South America, they bring clandestine radio sets, secret radio sets that they can use to transmit messages back to Berlin and to Hamburg. And when they transmit those messages, they encrypt them using codes and ciphers. So to be able to get a handle on what these Nazi spies are doing in South America during World War II, you need code breakers. J. Edgar Hoover volunteers to try to go in and get the Nazi spies. In 1940, he says, yeah, the FBI can do this, we got this. And he starts to send agents into South America to hunt down these Nazi spies. But the problem is that the agents aren't very good at this because the FBI doesn't really know what it's doing. The agents that go into South America don't know the language. There's a famous story about an FBI agent who was trained in New York to speak Spanish, and he was assigned to Brazil, and he was very disappointed when he arrived there to learn that he would need to know Portuguese. And more than that, the FBI was just not an agency that had any kind of code breaking capability. They had a technical laboratory, but it was essentially like a fingerprint lab. What they really needed was code breaking. They simply didn't have it. But guess who did? The Coast Guard, because they had Elizabeth Friedman. This is a picture of her and one of her teammates in early 1940s. So when World War II comes around, Elizabeth is ready to go. What do you need to be able to go after Nazi spies operating in South America? Well, you need an ability to intercept radio messages, and then you need an ability to analyze and solve those messages. You need code breaking, and then you need to read those messages and track them to be able to figure out, who the key players are in the spy networks and what they're doing and how they're talking to each other and what they're saying when they're transmitting back to Berlin. Elizabeth knew how to do this because she had already done it for years during Prohibition by going after the rum runners. Essentially, tracking the rum runners during the 1920s and 1930s for Elizabeth was kind of like a target practice for going after Nazis. And so the FBI, goes on kind of hand and knee to the Coast Guard and says, we need your help. And Elizabeth and her team start to help the FBI, and they start to map these hidden underworld networks. I don't have time to go into details here, but I did want to show you this. It turns out that the spies were using methods of transmitting secret messages that were very familiar to Elizabeth, because she and William and their kids would sometimes use these same methods in Christmas cards. So the Friedmans were famous for sending out a yearly sort of Christmas card in cipher. This is called a grill. So you have a grid of letters, and then you cut holes strategically. You put the grill over the grid of letters, and you turn it. It reveals different letters. It reveals a Christmas message. Well, this is a very similar method that was used by a lot of the Nazi spies initially. She also solved Enigma systems. She and her team were I think the first American code breaking team to solve an unknown Enigma in the wild. She generated thousands of decrypts, which are sort of solved, translated secret messages sent by Nazi spies on 50 different radio circuits that spanned the globe. And one by one, she started to light up these sort of darkened Nazi spy networks by illuminating their radio links and solving the messages. That picture on the left is a picture of the map of the Prohibition era ships. The picture on the right is a map that Elizabeth and her team made of the Nazi spy networks, and it's striking to me how similar they are. She used this knowledge to go after and catch some of the most dangerous Nazi spies of the day. This is a guy named Johannes Siegfried Becker. He was a SS captain who was beloved of Himmler. He was famous for his unusually long fingernails, which curled under his hands like the talon of a predatory bird. And he was incredibly effective until Elizabeth took him down. She solved really difficult machines, a cipher machine called the Kryha, and multiple Enigma machines that were used by the spies. I don't have time to get into this necessarily, but she ultimately uncovered messages like this one that showed that the Nazi spies in South America were forming alliances with Argentine security services, and their goal was to turn the southern part of South America into a block of pro-fascist countries. One of the people they were working with was this guy Juan Perón. I think that's Evita on the right. And the Nazi spies and the Argentine security folks never achieved this goal. Why didn't they achieve it? Because Elizabeth and her team were too good at their jobs. They tracked these spy networks, they tracked the radio circuits, and they ultimately fed this information to law enforcement, who were able to go in on the ground, bust up the rings, and arrest everyone. Okay, so cool story, right? Very cool story. When I learned about this, I was amazed. I thought, oh my gosh, you know, an American housewife, you know, essentially swept the Western Hemisphere free of undercover Nazis during World War II. Why haven't I heard this story before? Why was this some kind of secret? And there's two answers. One is it literally was one of the most closely kept secrets of the U.S. government for a long time. Top secret ultra. All of her decryptions were, after the war, taken from her and sent to classified areas of government vaults, and they were only declassified in a couple of years after 2000. So it was just not possible to actually read her work product for many years. The other reason that we don't know this story, and it was a secret, is because of J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was a master of publicity, and he ended up taking credit, stealing credit for the work that Elizabeth and her Coast Guard team had done in taking down the Nazi spy networks. It was not the FBI primarily that accomplished this task. It was Elizabeth and her Coast Guard team. But you would never know that because Hoover went out in public and wrote articles, even under his own name, claiming falsely that the FBI had been the brains behind all of this, and that they were the ones who had swept the Western Hemisphere free of these Nazi spy rings. It wasn't true, but Hoover had a lot of access to media. And so what happened was the FBI got credit for this. History wrote that the FBI did this, and Elizabeth was almost completely left out. In fact, a year after the war ended, Elizabeth was fired. And not only fired, but her entire Coast Guard code-breaking team was disbanded. So I'm going to end there, but I will suggest to you that Elizabeth ultimately got her revenge. It was kind of the revenge of a librarian, because she inserted a couple of things in her own papers in the Marshall Library that allowed me and some other people to comprehend the true nature of what she had done. There's some very savage things that she wrote on a couple of index cards about J. Edgar Hoover, who she absolutely hated. And these things stick out from the papers kind of like shards of glass. Even years later, they can draw blood. And so I was able to go back and kind of assemble these things. This was the only reference that I found in any papers in the Marshall Foundation that talked about her work during World War II. And it was just kind of an aside, that's what we did, the spy stuff. And given the concentrated efforts to kind of omit Elizabeth from history, it's been a really gratifying thing to try to kind of go through the papers, assemble them, put the pieces back together, and kind of deliver the story of Elizabeth's work as some kind of whole, because it is really incredible and inspiring. And there's nobody like her who has ever lived. So I'm going to stop talking there, and I would love to hear your questions.
Jason, we had one question early on. While at Riverbank, inmates from local women's prisons were utilized in experiments conducted by the scientists living and working there. What happened to the female inmates after the experiments were concluded?
That's a great question. I don't know. I wish I did know. I know that there was a cemetery there, and there were a lot of local rumors about the cemetery, that some inmates were buried there, or some of their children even were buried there. There were a lot of very dark and kind of macabre, facts and hints that Fabian was doing stuff that was very untoward with corpses. He kept a room actually at Riverbank that was decorated with human spines. He was obsessed with this idea that curved or malformed spines were a leading contributor to bad health of all sorts. And so he had all these programs to try to straighten people's backs, and particularly straighten the backs of women. And I mean, reading it from a distance of decades, it all seems like very, very creepy. But yeah, I don't know if there's anybody who's ever figured out a definitive answer to that question, but it's a good one. Should I stop my screen share at this point and just, Jessica?
That is completely up to you. If you wanted to, that'll move us more into the center.
Yeah. I'll stop it. Cool. Am I still screen sharing?
Yes.
All right, I'll stop it. There we go. Cool.
So one other question we have from, I believe it's Eileen. Thank you for writing a great book. In the film version of your book, what actor would you want to portray Elizabeth?
Does Eileen have an idea? I want to hear from Eileen, actually. I want to know. Is she able to talk and chat? Is she talking to you?
She hasn't responded yet, but hopefully she'll maybe give a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's any number of actresses could do a great job. Like I don't know. Emma Stone, I think, is amazing. I think she would be great. I don't know. Rachel Brosnahan could do a great job, I think. Amy Adams
mentions Kate Winslet.
Kate Winslet, yeah. I mean, it's fun to think. It really is fun to think about. I mean, I've thought a lot about who should be George Fabian. Like someone like J.K. Simmons would be an amazing George Fabian. I don't know. It's fun to think about.
Pam says, why did Elizabeth and her husband feel they had to leave at night?
Oh, I see. Sigourney Weaver and Renee Zellweger. Yeah, that's interesting. Why did they have to leave at night? So, so Fabian was a fairly dark personality in a lot of ways. He started to spy on them. He even intercepted some of their letters. When they found out about that, they didn't feel safe. There was also some intimation in the letters, and I wrote about this in the book, that Fabian had tried to, sexually harass or Elizabeth while William was in France, deployed in France during World War I. And I don't know that for a fact, but there's enough sort of suggestion in the letters that something happened there where Elizabeth felt extremely unsafe being around Fabian or even being at Riverbank at all. And so I think they were convinced, they left in the middle of the night because they were convinced that if they did it during the day and Fabian found out, he would send people after them and stop them, physically restrain them. And so they essentially tried to sneak out.
It looks like we had, was Elizabeth ever in personal danger during her years of code breaking of the rum runners who then were arrested and went to trial?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. She was testifying in open court in cases that required her to sit on the witness stand and face a table full of gangsters, essentially. There's a famous case in New Orleans in 1933 where some 20 guys who were members of a criminal rum running ring, including guys who were connected with Al Capone, were there in court. And in walks, a 5'3" petite American woman holding a pink bag and with a pink hat, with a flower pinned to the hat. She walks to the front of the court and she sits in the witness box and she just, stares at these guys. And she proceeds to explain her science of code breaking, what code breaking is, how she solved the messages, and and giving the jury everything that they needed to know to feel that the solutions were safe. And so, yes, there was a U.S. Marshal detail assigned to her during those cases and other cases. And for a time, Elizabeth's grandson told me this story. For a time during the 1930s, there were even Secret Service men who lived with the Friedmans in Washington because Elizabeth was doing so much of this work. And the story went that Elizabeth would cook for them, but the Secret Service men were not allowed to bring guns into the house, their guns into the house, because Elizabeth was a Quaker.
We had a question. Did Elizabeth have any affiliation as a teacher at any colleges, universities during World War II and after?
I don't think so. She studied on her own. I think she took some paleontology classes. I don't remember the university where she studied, but that was as an adult. Yeah, I don't think that she ever went back to teaching in any kind of a formal way, and it's a shame because in a big way, she was always kind of trying to get back to some job that wasn't breaking codes for the government. Anything in academia, anything in paleontology or archaeology, anything writing books, she would have been more than happy to spend her days doing it. But like I said, she was just too good.
And then we did have a question about did or does the NSA train their cryptologists today with the inspiring stories of the Friedmans?
Yes. Generations of NSA employees have learned and studied from materials that the Friedmans created originally, and there is increasing recognition of not just William's contributions to code breaking, but Elizabeth's contributions as well within the NSA. They co-named the auditorium at the NSA after Elizabeth. They added her to the dedication, and it seems like every year there's some kind of new acknowledgement from not just from NSA but from other government agencies too that Elizabeth was a big deal. Just a couple of months ago, I got word that the Coast Guard is naming one of their new cutter ships after Elizabeth. It's going to be named the Friedman after her. She's going to have a ship named after her, a giant ship. It's huge. It's yet to be built. It's going to be built in a shipyard on the Gulf. But I was thrilled when that happened. It happened, in part because of the files that I found that are published in the book, and I'm super thrilled and gratified about that. And I'm really looking forward to. I want to go to the ceremony where they dedicate the ship, where they do the thing with the Jessica, Steve, they do the champagne, right?
Yes.
Yes. They break the champagne bottle. Yeah, I want to be there when that happens.
Somebody asked, did our children follow in her parents' footsteps?
Yeah, not exactly. So they had two children, Barbara and John Ramsey, and neither one of them ended up going into code breaking. John Ramsey was in the media business, and Barbara had a number of jobs. She worked for a time for the Physicians Committee to end nuclear threats. I forget the exact name, but she was pushing for sort of peaceful uses of nuclear power and disarmament. But yeah, by the time I started working on the book, both Barbara and John Ramsey had passed, so I never got a chance to talk to them. But I did get a sense of them from their letters that they exchanged with Elizabeth, and a lot of those letters are in the Marshall Foundation collection. They're quite wonderful and vivid. And I talked to a few of her grandkids too, who have some materials of their own. It's funny that the book has kind of led to there was a whole reunion that happened in Indiana around the book and around sort of remembering Elizabeth, which is funny in a way, because Elizabeth never wanted anything except to get out of Indiana. But now all of her surviving sort of Indiana kin are learning about Elizabeth, and they're very proud of Elizabeth, and they want to talk about Elizabeth, and they want to gather and sort of share stories about Elizabeth. It's very cool.
Pam asks, have you visited the Cryptology Museum at Fort Meade? And I'll just add, was there any like, if you did, was there like specific research that they had or anything specific to the further understanding of
Yeah,
it?
there's when I was working on the book, that museum was in, I think, like a former motel that was next to Fort Meade, and they had converted it into a museum. And so I went around, I saw the materials that were relevant to the Friedmans that were there. And I think I looked at some books in the library that's on site. They're building a big new crypto library. And I don't know if it's on that site or not.
Yeah, let's see. Were the Dennis married couple ever able to share what they were working on with each other?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, when they were young, all of the time, every day, they were across a table from each other, and that was their joy. That was when they connected, and that was when they experienced the feeling of flying. The two minds working as one. Exploring new vistas and inventing new methods. That's when it all came together for them, when they were working together in their early 20s. As they became professionals to move to Washington, D.C., they started to diverge their paths. William was working for the Army. Elizabeth was working for a different set of agencies within the Treasury Department, which is where the Coast Guard is. And, during those decades, they were bound by secrecy rules to keep secrets from each other. So they did not have a habit of talking with each other about their work. In fact, William was so paranoid about it, and William's bosses were so adamant that he not tell Elizabeth anything, that he once complained bitterly that if it were up to the US government, he and Elizabeth would sleep in separate beds. And I think for years it was a strain and a hardship for them. And I think it's one of the sadder things about their lives. I don't see them as sad people, but I think this is one of a tragic element of the Friedmans, because they were so good and they were so close. And yet the work that they had to do for the government kept them apart in this really fundamental way. And there's something kind of sad to me about that. But they found, the wonderful thing to me is that they found ways to get beyond that by turning codes and ciphers into games that they could even bring their kids into, and their neighbors into, and their friends into. They're famous for throwing cipher parties in Washington, D.C. So you would get an invitation in the mail from Elizabeth, and it would tell you to show up to the Friedman house at such and such a time, and you would arrive, and Elizabeth would be in a very chic kind of gown, and William would be in a tuxedo. With polished shoes, and Elizabeth would hand you a second envelope, and it would have a puzzle. And once you solved the cryptogram inside the envelope, it would tell you the address of the restaurant that you had to go to get the first course of your meal. So you would go to the restaurant, you would eat the first course, and then you would be handed by William, who would be standing there, a second envelope, and it would have another puzzle, and you would solve the puzzle, and you'd have to go to another, careening across the city to another restaurant to get your main course. So they had a lot of, they were able to share it, they were able to open it up, and they were able to have fun with it.
I think we had a question. Some of these I'm going to put together too. So, but first, where are the Friedmans actually buried in terms of burials?
Yeah, really good question. They're buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and their gravestone actually includes a secret message that I solved with the help of a cipher expert named Alonka Dunan, and that was I think there's a couple of paragraphs about that in the book. It was a wild moment, but yeah, if you visit Arlington National Cemetery, you can visit their gravestone, check it out.
There was a question about, did their children have knowledge of their skills?
Yes, their children were, amazed, in awe of their parents' abilities. The Friedmans also taught their kids how to create codes and ciphers and how to break them. One of the letters that's in the Marshall Foundation files is a cryptogram that Barbara wrote to her parents from summer camp when she was about 9 or 10 years old. So it's a letter like any other kid would write from summer camp, except it's just written in cipher. And the reply from Elizabeth and William is also written in cipher. So from a very young age, Elizabeth and William brought their children into the family game and the family business.
I thought that was an adorable part of the book, including that Barbara writing in code and during summer camp and sending the letters home.
Yeah, I think it was partly a way for them to defy and to get around the intense secrecy of their government jobs. Is, when they weren't required to keep secrets, they really wanted code breaking, codes and ciphers to be something that everybody could understand, could play with, could have fun with, could enjoy. For Elizabeth, it was solving a secret message was always a thrill. She called it once the thrill of your life. The skeletons of words, peek out and make you jump. And she described it as just a visceral kick, that is having a solution appear at the end of your pencil, and that never really left for her.
Another question we had was, how long did it take you to write this book?
I think it was about 3 years from start to finish, but I'm not sure if that includes the months that I spent sort of just pondering the idea and not kind of pulling the trigger on it. But yeah, I think from the day I went to the Marshall Foundation Library for the first time and the day the book was published, I think it was about 3 years. And I was doing some other things during those 3 years, but mostly pretty much every day I just kind of I lived and breathed, the Friedmans. I woke up every morning thinking about Elizabeth. I went to bed every night thinking about the Friedmans. And those are the years when you become very strange to your own family, and they don't, you're just sort of kind of like wandering around in a daze, and they're wondering why you're knocking into walls and stuff, and it's because you're just thinking.
And then we had a question, 2 people have asked. One, are you working on a new book? And so that kind of relates to another question we had about, is there any project, what's your next project that you're looking to do?
I don't know. I'm open to ideas. If anybody has an incredible book idea they want to give away or lend me, I'm open to it. I don't have, for me, so I'm a full-time journalist and reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. So I have, my work life is very different now than when I was working on the book. When I was working on the book, I was freelance and working for myself, and now I have sort of a day job. And so, that would have to change if I wrote another book. But I'm always looking, and I'm always hoping that I'll have that same feeling that I had when I first started reading Elizabeth's letters. That feeling of just wild discovery and luck of finding something so incredible. And so vivid and so important and just so cool.
I don't know if I have any other questions. I'm trying to see if I missed anything.
See, there's a comment about J. Edgar, not just the glory hound, megalomaniac, narcissistic jerk. Yeah, I feel like I had gotten a picture of J. Edgar Hoover from pop culture as not the greatest human, but to really dig in on it in this specific way, with these in detail, with these couple of incidents, to see how he manipulated the media, used publicity, and stole credit from people who had done a lot of good work. It definitely gave me a feeling of him as as the duplicitous guy, which I think everyone understands, but also just kind of like a depraved attention seeker, which I didn't see J. Edgar Hoover that way before, and on top of that, also kind of
when it came to some technical competencies, also kind of a bumbler, which is not a picture that you get from pop culture about J. Edgar Hoover. He's often depicted as kind of an all-seeing, all-knowing, puppet master. But the truth was that, in a lot of technical aspects during World War II, the FBI was really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel in their own in their own department. They were just they were outclassed, and they were unprepared, and they just, when it came to code breaking, they didn't know what they were doing. It's really lucky that Elizabeth did know what she was doing.
Yeah, I think we got all of the questions. I think
those are really good questions, by the way. They're terrific.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. I'm also seeing comments in the chat about such a fascinating, interesting presentation, and this really was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for virtually visiting us in Adams County this evening. It was wonderful, and anyone who has not had a chance to read The Woman Who Smashed Codes, we do have copies in the system. There is currently a waiting list on the copies, but feel free to place yourself on hold for those. And we are wrapping up our one book month. There are still book discussions taking place throughout the month. Just check our events calendar online. And there's also a couple of month-long things that are still taking place. So definitely take a look at the events calendar and see what other fun things you can do. And as I said in the beginning of the presentation, we do have our programs for our one books from earlier this month, our one book programs available on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to take a look at that. The link is on our webpage. So again, thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a good evening.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed it. Maybe in the future we will meet in person in a future time, in a better time.
In a better time. Yes.
In a better time.